There were 6 of them, and Rhea had only one word left. She felt it in her sternum first, that particular stillness that preceded violence, the way sound itself seemed to thin and pull back, like tide retreating before a wave. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about Rhea that no one ever bothered to notice. Her hands were always steady. Even now, with the iron tang of fear sharp at the back of her throat, and the torchlight from the great hall's corridor catching the edges of 6 pairs of eyes gone wolf-bright in the dark, her fingers did not shake. They held the edges of the serving tray with the same flat, unhurried grip they always held it. She was 23 years old, white-skinned and slight, with ash-brown hair that had come half loose from its braid during the dinner service, and a thin scar at the base of her left thumb that she had stopped thinking about years ago. She was wearing a dress the color of old cream that had been mended at the left sleeve 3 times. She smelled, as she always smelled in the kitchen's estimation, of rendered fat and rosemary, and the faintest mineral trace of cold water from the pump she worked every morning before anyone else was awake. She did not smell of omega. That was the particular cruelty of it. She never had, not strongly, not in the way the pack hierarchy required, the way that made a wolf's hindbrain categorize and file a person away in their correct slot. She registered to most wolves the way a very old stone registers to a passing hand, present, cool, almost frictionless. The beta, whose name was Gregor, and who had a jaw like a blunt instrument and a ceremonial position that had made him drunk on his own consequence for the 15 years he had held it, had not bothered to look at her twice in the 3 months she had worked Ashgrove Keep's great hall. He looked at her now, not with apology, with the particular dismissal of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for the landscape to obey it. He had shoved her. That was the part the torchlight kept replaying in the back of her vision, his broad hand flat against her shoulder blade, the forward momentum he had imposed on her body without asking it, the way she had stumbled 2 steps into the corridor before her balance caught itself. The 6 wolves had been loitering there, enforcers from the northern delegation, 3 days into a summit that had gone poorly and now smelled of sour temper and unchecked rank. Gregor had wanted them managed. He had not wanted to manage them himself. So he had put his hand on the small of Rhea's back and redirected her, the way a man redirects a tool he is finished with, into the corridor where 6 enforcers stood between her and the far stairs. The tray had not fallen. She had caught it. The word was forming in her throat now, shaped by something older than training, older than the 3 years she had spent learning how to stand very still in rooms that wanted her smaller than she was. She had heard it called many things. Pack linguists called it a command route, the preverbal vocalization that wolves registered below conscious thought, that bypassed rank calculation and landed directly in the hindbrain's oldest territory. She had heard other omegas describe it as useless, theoretical, the kind of thing recorded in old texts that never survived actual contact with an enforcer's displeasure. She had never tested it. She had not known, until this exact moment, whether she had it in her at all. The largest of the 6 took a step toward her. His shoulders dropped into that particular forward hinge that meant he had stopped thinking in words. The torchlight made shadows of his cheekbones. Rhea exhaled. She let the tray rest against her hip. She opened her mouth, and she said the word, not loudly, the way a person shouts across a hall to be heard, but low and pressed and shaped from somewhere below her ribs, from the place where her lungs met the column of her spine, so that it traveled through the stone floor as much as through the air. The 6 wolves stopped. Not slowly, not the way people stop when they reconsider, all at once, like 6 clocks reaching the same second and choosing stillness as their answer. The silence afterward was enormous. Rhea did not move. She had learned, In the 12 years since she had first understood what she was, and what that meant in a world structured entirely around what she was not, that the moment after a surprising thing happened was frequently more dangerous than the surprising thing itself. So she stood still, and she held the tray against her hip, and she looked at the largest enforcer, with an expression she had been refining since she was 11 years old, not defiance, not pleading, but something level and unhurried, the expression of someone who has already made the calculation and found it came out in her favor. 34 days ago, she had not known this night would come. That was 34 days ago. Rhea had arrived at Ashgrove Keep on a morning in early autumn when the birch trees along the approach road had just begun to turn, their leaves going from green to the pale gold that looked, in certain slants of light, like something hammered rather than grown. She had walked the last 4 miles because the cart driver who had agreed to carry her from the valley town had decided, at the junction where the Keep's road diverged from the main pass, that he wanted something from her that she did not intend to give. The negotiation had been brief. She had walked away from it with her pack on her back and a bruise forming along her right jaw that she had catalogued with the same flat attention she gave to all injuries: location, severity, timeline to resolution. 4 to 6 days for the bruising. She had been accurate. She had come because there was work. That was the whole of the reason, and she had not dressed it in anything more complicated than that. Pack politics had a way of generating service positions at Keeps during summit season: cooks, servers, laundresses, scribes, and Rhea had learned over the 3 years since she had left the Valley Pack that kept her name in its lowest register that her particular combination of skills fit neatly into the gaps such positions required. She cooked well. She carried things without complaint. She had a memory for faces and for the precise social gradations that governed which alpha ate before which elder, which delegation's scent markers should not be placed on adjacent tables, which wolf was likely to make a scene about the temperature of their meat, and which would make a quieter, more dangerous scene about other things. She had learned this the way she learned most things, by watching while people looked through her. The head cook, a broad woman named Sable, who smelled of wood smoke and pepper, and who conducted her kitchen with the efficiency of a general who had already won and merely had to administer the peace, had looked at Rhea for approximately 4 seconds on the morning of her arrival before making a decision. "You're thin," Sable had said, by way of greeting. "Can you lift?" Rhea had lifted the thing indicated, which was a copper pot that held approximately 12 liters of stock and had been full. She had carried it to where Sable pointed and set it down without sloshing. "Fine," Sable had said, and that had been the entirety of the hiring process. She had been given a cot in the servants' corridor and 3 meals per day and a copper coin at the end of every 6-day cycle, which was not generous but was, crucially, consistent. The work was familiar: carrying, serving, clearing, existing in rooms in a way that produced nothing in the wolves who occupied them, no discomfort, no awareness, no memorable impression of any kind. She was 23. She had been practicing invisibility since she was old enough to understand that being seen, in her particular case, had never meant being seen favorably. The summit had been underway for 11 days when she first understood that something was wrong with it. She had a habit of noting things, and she noted them now. The way the northern delegation's wolves sat too close to each other in the hall, their bodies angled inward as though conserving something. The way their scent had a particular tight undercurrent that she associated, from careful observation over years, with groups of wolves who were waiting for permission to do something they had already decided they would do. The way the senior envoy, a silver-haired wolf named Vorath, had twice stopped speaking mid-sentence when the hall's side doors opened, as though his attention lived somewhere outside the room and only visited on occasion. She noted all of this and kept serving and said nothing because she was Rhea, and saying nothing was the infrastructure upon which her life had been built. She noted the Beta Gregor, too. He moved through the hall with the particular energy of a man whose authority was entirely ceremonial and who had organized his entire personality around the prevention of anyone discovering this. He spoke too firmly to the kitchen staff. He positioned himself near the Alpha King's empty chair. Caspian had not yet arrived for the summit, was expected on the 16th day, which was still 5 days away, with the posture of a man auditioning for a role in which he did not quite believe himself. He had looked at Rhea precisely twice in 11 days, and both times with the smooth vacancy of someone who had processed her correctly as background element and filed her accordingly. She had found the child on the 14th day. That required a rewind of its own. The 14th day had been a Tuesday, which mattered only because Tuesdays were when the East Wing's utility corridor received its weekly delivery of lamp oil and fresh torch wrappings, which meant the passage was temporarily crowded with supply carts, and the usual route from the kitchen to the upper serving stations was blocked for approximately 40 minutes. Rhea had taken the alternate route, which ran behind the old granary wall and through a low-ceilinged passage that smelled of mildew and old stone, and, on this particular Tuesday, also smelled of something very small and very frightened. She had stopped, not because she had been told to, because her body had stopped before she had finished deciding, her feet going still on the flagstones with the certainty of a person who has learned not to argue with instinct. The pup was tucked behind a broken section of the granary wall's inner facing, in a gap between the stone and a rotting support beam that would have been invisible to anyone not standing at exactly Rhea's height and angle. He was perhaps 4 years old, white-haired, with the particular silver-tinged pallor that indicated royal blood. She recognized it distantly, the way one recognizes a significant detail before understanding why it is significant. He was not bleeding. He was not injured. He was curled small and deeply still, in the way of a child who had learned that stillness was a protection, and he was very cold, and he had not made a sound, and his eyes, when they found Rhea's face, were the color of winter ice, and entirely too old for his face. She had said, very quietly, "All right." It had not been addressed to him particularly. It had been addressed to the situation, which was her custom. She had crouched down, and she had held out her hand, not reaching, just presenting, and she had waited the way she knew how to wait, which was indefinitely. It had taken him 4 minutes to reach for it. She had counted. His name, she would learn across the days that followed, was Luca. He would tell her almost nothing else, and she would not press him, because pressing was not in her repertoire, and because she was old enough to understand that a royal pup hidden alone in a granary passage during a fraught political summit was a secret that had architecture to it, walls and weight-bearing elements, and the particular structural integrity of something that would bring the ceiling down if you pulled the wrong piece. So she had warmed him and fed him and returned him to the gap in the wall and come back the next day and the day after and the 19 days that followed, and she had not told anyone. That was the thing she kept having to account for in the private arithmetic of her conscience. She had not told anyone, not Sable, not the keep's household steward, not the half-dozen wolves she passed in corridors, who might have been positioned to do something useful with the information. She had kept the secret of a hidden royal pup for 19 days, while carrying serving trays through a hall full of wolves who were, she became increasingly certain, looking for him, and she had done it in part because she did not trust any of the wolves she could have told, and in part because Luca, on the 5th day, had looked at her with those ice-pale eyes and said, very quietly, and without any of the expressiveness of a child who expected to be listened to, "If the northern wolves find me, they take me back. My father comes and there is a war and people die." And then he had gone back to the piece of dried apple she had brought him and said nothing else. She had found, upon examining the information, that she believed him, not because she knew the politics, because she knew the northern delegation's scent. The ordeal of feeding a hidden child across 19 days of summit service without being caught had its own specific texture, which was the texture of all the small, precise deceptions that constructed an apparently normal life around an abnormal center. She started waking at 4 in the morning instead of 5, using the extra hour to prepare a second, unofficial portion of whatever the kitchen was producing for the day: bread, broth, cold roast, dried fruit, and concealing it in the lining of her work apron, which she had unpicked and re-sewn on the third day to create a flat interior pocket that did not alter the garment's silhouette in any way a passing glance would catch. She adjusted her twice-daily route through the granary passage to occur at the moments of maximum corridor traffic elsewhere, so her presence there coincided with noise that would mask the small sounds of a child eating. She noted when the northern delegation sent wolves to walk the service corridors, 3 times in the first week, 5 times in the second, and she timed her visits to Luca around the gaps. It was exhausting in the specific way that sustained deception is exhausting, which has nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the portion of the mind that must run a constant low-frequency calculation alongside every surface task. She grew thinner. Sable noticed and added extra bread to her own plate without comment, which was the closest thing Rhea had received to maternal concern in some years, and she had eaten the bread and been grateful for it and not explained. She had, by the 33rd day of her time at Ashgrove Keep, developed what she privately identified as a contingency problem. She did not know when Caspian would arrive. She did not know what his arrival would mean for Luca's safety, and she did not know whether the northern delegation's increasingly agitated searching of the keep's outer passages meant they were close to finding what they were looking for. The northern envoy Vorath had started watching her at dinner service with an attention that was different from Gregor's blank processing, more focused, less certain, the attention of a man who has identified a discrepancy and cannot determine whether it is meaningful. On the 34th day, Gregor had put his hand between her shoulder blades and shoved. The 6 enforcers in the corridor had scented her as soon as she stumbled into their space, and she had watched Vorath's calculation run behind his eyes in real time. The Omega who keeps appearing in the granary passage, who smells faintly of child and cold stone and something he cannot quite identify, who has been moving with the particular careful economy of someone carrying something secret. His eyes had found hers in the torchlight, with the flat, confirming weight of a man who has decided he already knows the answer and is now verifying it. She had said the word. She had not known she could, and now she had. The stillness held for 3 seconds, perhaps 4. It was not submission. The enforcers were still upright, still orientated toward her, still capable of reversing the stasis at any moment. It was more like the pause a fire takes when something interrupts its oxygen, a temporary suspension that depended entirely on whether the next thing that happened gave it cause to restart. Rhea understood this. She also understood that the next thing would happen in the next 3 to 5 seconds, and that she had approximately that much time to determine what it was. "She carries the pup's scent," Vorath said from behind her. He had come out of the hall doorway without sound. His voice was careful and particular, the voice of a man who had negotiated at the highest level for long enough that even his most dangerous sentences sounded like invitations. "I am not going to hurt you. I simply want to know where the boy is." Rhea did not turn around. "I don't know what boy you mean." "Your scent tells a different story." "My scent," she said, still not turning, "tells you I have been working in a kitchen for 34 days and that I carry whatever I have been near. There are children in the servants' quarters. Not royal children." She felt rather than heard the enforcer in front of her shift his weight, the pause breaking at its edges like ice beginning to separate. Her word had done its work. That work was finished. She had perhaps 6 seconds of residual authority, and then it would be weight and number and proximity, and those calculations did not come out in her favor. She had spent 19 days making sure it would not come to this. It had come to this anyway. She thought of Luca in the granary gap, eating the bread she had left him that morning, waiting for her to come back at nightfall. She thought of his ice-pale eyes. She thought of what he had said about war and people dying, and she thought about the distance between saying such a thing and having it be true, and she found that distance was smaller than she had hoped. She took a breath. She straightened her spine. "Move aside," she said. "Not the word this time, just words. Or send for your king. Let him decide what his enforcers do to a serving woman in a corridor." "The king is not here," Vorath said. "He is," said a voice from the far end of the corridor that none of them had watched, because none of them had believed that end of the corridor was relevant. "He has been here for 12 minutes. The voice arrived in the corridor like cold water poured over a fire. Not the end of the fire, exactly, but its sudden recalibration. All 6 enforcers turned. Vorath's breath caught. Rhea did not move. She heard him before she understood what she was hearing. Boots on stone, a deliberate, unhurried pace that produced sound in the way of someone who has never once in their life needed to announce themselves, and has therefore developed no habit of doing so. The scent reached her approximately 4 seconds before the voice had come, though she had not identified it then, had taken it for a change in the corridor's air, the faint cedar and cold stone smell of someone who had traveled a long road in cold weather and not yet crossed a threshold where indoor warmth could displace the journey from their clothing. It was a clean smell. She had catalogued it without attaching it to anything. She was attaching it now. Caspian was here. He had arrived in the city 5 hours ahead of his expected schedule, his entourage reduced to 8 wolves for the last leg of the journey, because he had, for reasons his chamberlain would describe later, with the weary precision of a man who had surrendered to the fact of his king's unpredictable judgment, chosen to ride ahead. He had come in through the keep's eastern gate at the approach of the night's first watch, and had been intercepted by exactly no one, because the eastern gate's watch had been pulled to reinforce the main hall's perimeter during an earlier incident involving the northern delegation's junior wolves, and a disagreement about seating precedents that had produced more noise than damage. He had been walking the keep's interior corridors for 12 minutes, as he had said, learning its current arrangement in the way he always learned new spaces, on foot, without announcement, gathering the smell and sound of the place before committing its geography to his mental map. He had learned Ashgrove's upper halls, and the great hall's approach corridor, and the kitchen's back passage, and the east wing's connecting route. He had been in the process of learning the granary corridor when the scent had reached him. Not the pup's scent. He had caught that too, threading through the cold stone smell, and it had stopped his breath for a different reason. He would return to that. But first, the woman's scent. He had not been able to name what it did to him immediately, which was itself anomalous. He had very fast categorizing reflexes, the product of 15 years of practice at a level where being slow to categorize was a form of danger. This had taken him 4 full seconds to process, and even at the end of those 4 seconds he had not fully processed it. She smelled of rosemary and cold water and rendered fat, which were kitchen smells, surface impressions, the smell of her work. Under that, accessible to a wolf with the specific patient attention Caspian had been trained to bring to the world's subtler signals, there was something else, something that the older, less verbal part of him had recognized before the verbal part had finished receiving the signal. He had felt his wolf go absolutely still, not aggressive still, not the stillness before a hunt, the other kind, the held breath, caught moment stillness of something that has been looking for a very long time and has just, without warning, finished looking. Mine, the wolf had said. One word, the oldest word in the language his other self spoke, and it had hit him in the chest like something irrevocable. He had continued walking. He was good, very good, at walking toward things that his body was telling him were dangerous in one way or another. He was good at keeping his face arranged, and his breathing even, and his hands at his sides, rather than closed into fists, which was what they wanted to do. He was 15 years into a kingship that had required him to be good at exactly these things. He came around the last turn of the corridor and found her there, found all of them there, 6 of his northern diplomatic counterparts enforcers, and Vorath, and his own Beta Gregor, hovering at the hall doorway, with the expression of a man hoping the landscape would stop asking him questions. And what he saw first, before he had fully processed faces or read the room's political topography, was her back. White skin where the shoulder of her dress had slipped, ash-brown hair half escaped from its braid, a serving tray held against her hip with both hands, absolutely steady. A body that had organized itself, in the middle of what was clearly a very bad situation, with a composure so complete, it struck him as the kind of composure that is not put on but grown, the composure of a person who has been tested precisely this much on a regular basis and has stopped being surprised by it. Her scent hit him again, full and close, and his chest did the thing it had done in the corridor, which was to simply stop for one breath and then start again, and it was not entirely clear to the wolf behind his ribs that this had been his own decision. He kept his voice even. He produced the fact of his arrival as a fact, not a performance, which was the only way he knew how to produce anything. He said he had been there 12 minutes, and he watched the 6 enforcers turn and the calculation run through the room like current through standing water, the same current that always ran through a room when a person in it suddenly remembered where actual authority resided. Then, because there were several things happening simultaneously, and he was going to have to address all of them, and the order mattered, he looked at Vorath, and he said, "Step back." Vorath stepped back. He did not do it quickly enough. There was a half-second of the particular hesitation that meant the northern envoy was running a calculation about whether the political cost of compliance was worth paying. But he paid it, because in the end, Vorath was a man who understood leverage, and the leverage in this corridor had just rearranged itself. Caspian walked the length of the corridor, and he stopped when he was standing directly beside the woman, and not quite between her and the enforcers, because standing between her and them would be a communication he was not ready to make publicly in this moment, not without understanding more. He looked at the enforcers. He said, "You are 30 feet inside a wing of this keep that was not designated for northern delegation access. Walk back to your quarters. I will speak with Vorath in the morning." The enforcers walked. They went with the smooth, contained efficiency of wolves, who are accustomed to obeying superior rank, and who, if they had any opinions about the evening's events, were wise enough to save them for each other's company. The corridor emptied. Gregor opened his mouth. "My lord, I must explain." "You must," Caspian agreed, without looking at him. "Tomorrow." Gregor closed his mouth and retreated into the hall, and the door shut with a sound that was far too ordinary for the moment it was marking. Then it was just the 2 of them in the corridor, and the torchlight, and the cedar and cold stone smell of him that Rhea had not yet named, and the kitchen smell of her that he had named privately and irrevocably, in a way he was not prepared to act on, for approximately 45 reasons, the first of which was that she was still holding her serving tray with both hands and looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone completing a risk assessment. He said, "Are you hurt?" She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone deciding what to say, the silence of someone checking, with genuine empirical attention, whether the answer to the question was yes or no. "No," she said finally. "Gregor shoved me. I kept my footing." She paused. The tray didn't fall. The irrelevance of that detail, delivered in the same flat, practical tone as the rest of it, did something to Caspian's chest that he was going to have to think about at a later time when he was alone. He said, "I have a question." "You have more than one," she said. That was true. He looked at her profile. She had not turned all the way toward him, was still mostly looking at the middle distance, as though direct eye contact were a resource she was conserving. Ivory pale skin, a jaw set with the specific angle of controlled exhaustion, a scar at the base of her left thumb that she did not seem to be aware of favoring, even though her grip around the tray's edge showed the small, involuntary compensation of an old injury. He looked at her, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, carefully, without announcement. "What did you say to them?" he asked, "before I came around the corner?" She turned her head and looked at him then, all the way, for the first time. Her eyes were grey-green, pale, and direct. "One word," she said. "I don't know if I can do it twice." He held her gaze. His wolf had gone very quiet, the way it went quiet when something significant was happening that required patience. He breathed through the complicated awareness of her scent, and he said, "The northern delegation has been searching this keep for something." "Not something, someone." He watched her face. "The pup. He is somewhere in this keep." The smallest thing happened to her expression, not a flinch, more like a decision crystallizing. "Yes," she said. "You know where he is." "Yes." "You have known for some time." 19 days, she said. He counted that back without commenting on it. 19 days. The summit had been underway for 33 days. She had been carrying this for more than half its duration. "He is safe?" Caspian asked. "He was. When I left him this morning. I don't know about now." For the first time, something underneath her composure showed itself. Not fear, not distress, but urgency, the clean, functional kind, the urgency of someone who has a task and wants to be permitted to return to it. "I need to go to him," Caspian said. "Show me." She led him through the granary passage without hesitation, which told him she had walked it many times in the dark. The torchlight did not reach all of it, and she moved through the lightless stretches with the confidence of someone who had memorized the floor's unevenness and the precise location of the low beam at the passage's midpoint, which she ducked under without breaking stride. He had to duck lower. He was taller, and he noted this without comment. She was carrying the tray still. She had not set it down. He decided not to mention this either. The gap in the granary wall was invisible until they were standing directly in front of it. She crouched. She said, very quietly, "Luca, it's me. I've brought someone." Silence. Then the small, careful sound of a child re-examining a situation. "Who?" said a voice that was too measured for its age. "The king," Ria said, with the exact same inflection she used for everything else. Another silence. Then, "My father?" "No," Caspian said, crouching beside her. "Not your father, Caspian of Ashgrove. Your father sent me ahead to find you." He had not known, until he said it, that he was going to say it. But it was true, in the way that things become true once a king decides they are, and then arranges the facts accordingly. He would send word in the morning. He would arrange the facts. "You have been very patient," he said to the dark gap in the wall. A small hand appeared at the edge of the stone, then a face, ice-pale eyes, silver-white hair, the particular exhausted dignity of a child who has been waiting for someone trustworthy to arrive and is not yet entirely convinced that wait is over. The ice-pale eyes moved from Caspian to Ria. They stayed on Ria. "She kept me safe," Luca said. It was not a question, and it was not a statement of surprise. It was the voice of a child reporting a fact about the world as he had found it. "I know," Caspian said. He looked at Rhea in the torchlight, and she was already looking at the child and not at him, her expression doing something he would have described, if asked, as fiercely, quietly fond, the expression of someone who has been careful about a thing for a very long time and is feeling the first tremor of permission to stop being quite so careful. He felt his wolf say nothing at all, just held the moment, just watched her. He had her brought out of the servants' corridor that same night. Not dramatically. There was no announcement, no summons, no ceremony. What happened was simpler than that. He called for the keep's senior household steward and told him that the serving woman from the kitchen, whose name he learned in that moment was Rhea, would be moved to a chamber in the keep's guest wing immediately, and that she would be given whatever she needed, and that this was to be done now, not in the morning. The steward, who had been reading the room all evening with the professional accuracy of a man whose entire career was built on correctly reading rooms, wrote her name in his ledger without a question. Luca was settled in a chamber 2 doors from Rhea's, with a guard Caspian trusted at the door, and a fire built high enough to push the chill out of walls that had been cold for 19 days at least. He had eaten. He had slept, though not deeply. Rhea checked once, quietly, and came back to report this to Caspian in the corridor outside with the same unembellished practicality she brought to all reports, and he listened and nodded, and then found himself in the particular position of not wanting her to go back to her own room yet. He did not act on this. He said good night, and he went to deal with the 17 things that required his attention as a result of the evening's events, beginning with Gregor, which took 45 minutes, and ended with Gregor's understanding, delivered without visible emotion, by Caspian in the same level tone he used for everything, that a hand laid on a person in this keep, with force and without consent, was a beta's last administrative act. Gregor had gone pale under the specifics of what this implied for his position. He dealt with Vorath in the morning, as he had promised. That conversation lasted 2 hours, and took place in the formal receiving chamber, with the keep's senior pack council and a representative of the northern delegation's nominal governing body present. Because Caspian had sent a raven at first light, and the response he received within the hour, from Luca's father, a southern border king who had been searching for his son with increasing desperation through channels that had not intersected with Ashgrove's summit until now, clarified exactly what had happened and who had arranged it. Vorath left the conversation with fewer options than he had arrived with, and the particular manner of a man who is deciding which version of events to tell himself for the rest of his life. Caspian let him have that. He was more interested in the fact that Rhea was in the breakfast kitchen when he walked through it after the council session, back in her work apron, carrying bread from the oven to the service table, with the same flat, economical efficiency she apparently brought to everything. She had been there for 40 minutes. Sable, who ran the kitchen with the authority of someone who had survived 6 different kings and knew that the trick was to simply keep producing bread, regardless of which one was currently governing, had apparently said nothing about this return to service. She had simply handed Rhea the bread. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The kitchen staff noticed him. There was the small, rippling behavioral adjustment of wolves, registering superior rank in their space. But Rhea's back was to the door, and she did not immediately turn. He had a moment, then, of watching her work. She was efficient without being hurried. She knew where everything was. She moved through the kitchen's morning chaos with the sureness of someone who has mapped a space thoroughly enough that they no longer have to think about it. "Rhea," he said. She turned, and her expression when she found him in the doorway did the same thing it had done in the corridor the night before, a single, precise recalibration, like a compass adjusting. She was still holding the bread. "My lord," she said, "come with me when you're finished." She transferred the bread to the service table and came immediately, which suggested that she had reached the same conclusion he had about what the morning's next conversation needed to be. He took her to the small council room rather than the formal chamber, because the formal chamber was wrong for this. Too large, too staged, the kind of room that produced a particular dynamic between the people in it that he wanted to avoid. The small council room had a fire and 2 chairs and a window that looked out over the keep's kitchen garden, where the autumn bare herb beds made neat grey lines in the frost. He had bread and tea brought, because she had been in the kitchen long enough that he doubted she had eaten any of the bread herself. She sat down when he indicated the chair across from him. She held the teacup with both hands, the way a person does when they are colder than they have been acknowledging. He said, "You hid the pup for 19 days, alone, while serving daily in a hall that contained the wolves who were looking for him." She looked at the tea. "Yes." "Why did you not bring it to someone with authority to act on it?" "Because I did not know," she said, "who could be trusted, and because Luca asked me not to." She looked up. "I have learned to take that kind of request seriously." An instruction from a 4-year-old, an assessment from a 4-year-old who had survived whatever had happened to him before I found him, by knowing when to be still and when to trust, and that those 2 things were not always the same situation. She paused. He was right, more than I was. Caspian looked at her. "You are an omega," he said, not as a classification, more like a fact he was reading aloud from a document he was reading carefully. Something moved through her expression. Not hurt. It was past hurt. Whatever it was something that had been past hurt for long enough that it had settled into a kind of clear-eyed weariness. "Most wolves look at me and get nothing," she said. "That has been true my whole life." "I am not most wolves," he said. Her eyes came up to his and held there, and he watched her decide whether to argue with that. She decided not to. "No," she said, "you are not." He breathed through the scent of her, rosemary and cold water, and underneath it, the thing he had first caught in the corridor, the clean, irrevocable something that his wolf had already made its verdict on. He said, "The word you used last night in the corridor. I have never used it before." "I know," he paused. "The command route is documented in pack history as belonging to one bloodline, a maternal line that has not been recorded in active inheritance for 2 generations. He watched her face. "Your mother's name." A beat of silence. "Eris," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Eris of the Fernwood Valley pack, who died 14 years ago, whose daughter was listed in that pack's registry as unclassified, not Alpha, not Beta, not Omega, not any category the pack elders could agree on." He watched the recognition move through her expression, slow and enormous, the way light moves through deep water. Because she was all of them, and none of them fit. Rhea set down the teacup. She looked at her hands. "The scar at the base of her left thumb," she said, very quietly. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that your bloodline predates the classification system, that the command route you carry is not an omega trait, it is a sovereignty trait. It is the oldest form of pack authority this world has, and it has been sitting in a kitchen for 34 days. Unquote. The fire made its sound. The window showed frost. She said, "I carried bread." "I know," she said. "I unpicked my apron and re-sewed it to hide food in the lining." "I know," she said. "I slept on a cot in the servants' corridor." "You will not," he said, "be doing any of those things from this point forward." He held her gaze. "Unless you choose to. The bread was your choice. The apron was your choice. 19 days protecting that child was your choice. That is what sovereignty looks like. I have been a king for 15 years, and I have not always made it look that clean." She looked at him for a long time with those grey-green eyes that were pale and direct, and that had, he suspected, seen the truth of things very clearly for most of her life, and simply had no mechanism through which other people could know that. His wolf was quiet. Not the urgent, claiming quiet of the corridor, something slower and more settled, the quiet of something that has been running for a very long time and has found the place it was running toward and stopped. He said, "I need to tell you what I scented when I was 12 minutes into this keep, and had not yet come around that last corner. "You don't have to," she said. "I do," he said, "because you have spent your life in a world that has not told you accurate things about yourself. And this is accurate. This is the most accurate thing I know how to say." He held her gaze. "The mate bond does not lie. I have been a king for 15 years, and I have gone to considerable effort to avoid this exact situation for most of them, because a mating between a king and an omega produces complications that— none of that is relevant, actually. None of that is relevant. My wolf knew you in a corridor before I had seen your face, and it has not been wrong about anything important in 15 years, and I am not going to treat it as wrong now." Rhea was very still. Not the stillness of the granary corridor. Not the compressed, high-stakes stillness of someone managing immediate danger. A different stillness. The stillness of someone who has been very careful for a very long time and has just been given, with unexpected clarity, the terms under which they might be allowed to stop. She said, "I am not an omega. You just told me that." "No," he said, "you are not. You are something older than that. And you have been made invisible by a system that did not have vocabulary for what you actually are. That is," she said, after a moment, "an enormous amount of information to receive before midday." He felt the corner of his mouth do something. It did not become a smile, exactly, but it acknowledged the observation. "Yes," he said, "it is." She picked up the teacup again. She looked at the frost on the kitchen garden. She said, "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "Luca goes home when his father arrives in 4 days, with an escort that will preclude any further interference from the northern delegation. Vorath returns to his governing council with the understanding that their next diplomatic request will be evaluated in the context of this summit's events." He paused. "And you stay." She looked at him. "Stay. In the keep, not in the servants' corridor." He held her gaze. "I am not asking you to decide anything permanent today. I am asking you to stay long enough to eat breakfast before you are handed more bread to carry somewhere." Something moved across her face. It was not the enormous, complicated thing of earlier. It was smaller and quieter. She looked at the bread on the table between them, which had been there the whole conversation untouched, and she tore a small piece of it and ate it with the careful, deliberate attention of someone tasting something they have been refusing to allow themselves. He watched her eat. His wolf did not need to say anything. His wolf was simply, entirely present. The 4 days before Luca's father arrived were not dramatic. This was, in retrospect, remarkable, given the material. The northern delegation stayed within their designated wing of the keep and generated no further incidents. Gregor tendered his resignation from the beta position on the 2nd day, with the particular formal language of someone who has decided to frame a removal as a choice. Caspian accepted it with equal formality and announced, without preamble, that the position was under review. The keep's household adjusted to the new information about Rhea's presence in the guest wing with the smooth, nearly instantaneous recalibration that wolf households exhibited when rank signals rearranged themselves, a door held here, a deferential step back there, a ripple of behavioral adjustment running through the staff in the way of current through water, silent and complete. Rhea noticed all of this. She noticed the door held that had never been held before, the slight backward lean of the storage clerk, who had previously always positioned his body in the corridor's center, regardless of who needed to pass. She noticed these things with the same flat, cataloging attention she had always brought to the world, and she stored them, and she did not yet know what to do with them because she had been making herself invisible for so long that being seen was a form of information she was still learning to process. She went to see Luca every morning. He was recovering with the speed of a child who has been cold and frightened for a long time and has been given warmth and food and the absence of immediate threat, which is to say, faster than an adult would, but with a watchful quality that did not disappear at the same rate as the physical signs of strain. He ate well. He slept better on the third day than he had on the first. He asked once, quietly, whether Ria was going to leave, and she had said she did not know yet, and he had accepted this with the same gravity with which he apparently accepted most information, and then asked if there were more dried apples, because there had not been dried apples where he was from, at least not this kind. She brought him dried apples. She brought them from the kitchen herself, because Sable had looked at her the first morning after the corridor incident with an expression that contained nothing she was going to say out loud, but that communicated, with the efficiency of a woman who had run a kitchen for 20 years, a great deal about what she thought. Ria had taken the dried apples and said thank you, and Sable had handed her a second portion without being asked. On the fourth morning, Caspian found her in the kitchen garden. She did not know, afterward, whether he had come looking or whether the garden had simply been in his path. She had come out because the frost had lifted overnight, and the herb beds had a particular wet earth smell that she had wanted to be near, the smell of things that had been cold for a long time, beginning to remember what warmth felt like. She was crouching by the rosemary bed, the irony of this not lost on her. She smelled of rosemary. She had always smelled of rosemary. She had never thought of it as anything but a kitchen smell, until the last 4 days had given her reason to think about everything differently. He came and stood beside her, and did not crouch, just stood with his hands at his sides, and looked at the herb bed with the same patient attention he appeared to bring to most things. He smelled of cold stone and cedar, and the dry-wool warmth of a heavy cloak worn in cold weather, and underneath that, when the breeze moved the right direction, something she had no name for yet, but was learning the shape of. "Luca's father sends an advance rider this morning," he said. "He arrives tomorrow with a formal escort." She nodded. "When he comes," Caspian said, "he will want to express his gratitude." She looked at the rosemary. "He doesn't have to." "He will want to," Caspian said again, with a particular evenness that she was coming to recognize as the way he distinguished between things that were up for discussion and things that were facts. "You kept his son alive for 19 days, with nothing except good judgment and an unpicked apron. He will have something to say about that, and you are going to let him say it." She stood up. She looked at him. "You are used to telling people what they are going to do." "Yes," he said, without any particular defensiveness. "It is frequently efficient. And if I tell you it isn't efficient, in this case, because I am not good at being thanked." He looked at her with the careful, reading attention she was also coming to recognize. "Then I would say that you have been invisible for long enough that discomfort at being seen is understandable, and that I am not going to use that discomfort as a reason to let you stay invisible." He paused. "You stopped 6 wolves in a corridor, with 1 word. You fed a royal pup for 19 days without detection. You walked into my council room and told me the truth without softening it. You are not someone who lacks capacity for recognition. You are someone who has not been given it. Those are different problems." The breeze moved. She breathed. She said, "The bond. What you said yesterday. Yes, I have not felt anything, in the way you described." She looked at her hands. "The scar. Or, I have felt things that I did not have language for, that I thought were something else." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you think they were?" she said, very carefully, as though each word were load-bearing and she was checking the weight before placing it. "I thought I was simply feeling what it was to be near someone who was not looking through me." Caspian was still. It was the profound, internal stillness she had first seen in the corridor, the one that she now understood to be restraint rather than passivity, the quality of a very strong thing choosing not to use its strength in one direction so that it can direct it somewhere more important. His wolf, she would learn later, had heard this and had said something ancient and singular into the quiet of him, and he had breathed through it and stood still. "Is that less than what you want?" he said. "Or is it enough?" She looked at him, grey-green eyes, direct, pale. The frost was gone from the herb beds. The kitchen garden smelled of wet earth and old rosemary, and the coming winter, and the complicated question of what a person who has been made invisible does when the world begins to notice she is there. "Ask me again," she said, "in a year." He nodded. Once. The way he agreed to things he considered settled. Luca's father arrived with his escort the following morning and said what he needed to say in the formal receiving chamber with the keep's council present, and Rhea stood and received it with her back straight and her hands at her sides and her expression level, and if the discomfort of being seen in that formal, public way was considerable, she did not let it show in any way anyone watching could name. Caspian, standing to her left, said nothing. He did not need to. The room's arrangement said what needed to be said, and every wolf present read the room's arrangement with the involuntary accuracy of their biology. The winter came, in full 2 weeks after that. The herb beds went grey, and the keep's corridors grew cold between the torch points, and the summit concluded its final session, and the delegations departed one by one, until the keep held only its own pack, and the household staff, and the king who had decided, without making a formal announcement about it, that he would winter here rather than at the capital, which was where he usually wintered. Rhea stopped sleeping in the guest wing's chamber after the 3rd week, not because she was moved, because the guest wing's chamber was too far from the wing where the keep's working library was, and she had discovered the library on a restless night in the 2nd week, had spent 3 hours in it reading the old pack records with the lamp turned low, and had come back every night since. Caspian found her there on the 9th night, which meant he had not been looking for her on the first 8, or had known where she was and left her to it, which she thought more likely. He sat down across the table from her without asking. He read his own documents. She read hers, the lamp burned between them. This became, with no formal acknowledgement on either side, the shape of their evenings. She stayed. That was the short version, and it was also the accurate version. She stayed through the winter and into the first turning of the year, and the bond deepened the way bonds deepen when they are given time and proximity and the specific warmth of two people who have each been alone in their own way for long enough that being not alone is a thing they have to grow into carefully, like a limb healing. He marked her on a night in early spring, in the library, with the lamp burned low, and the frost gone from the window glass, and the first pale suggestion of light beginning at the eastern horizon. It was not ceremonial, it was not public. It was between the two of them, and the quiet of the room, and the understanding, which had been growing between them for months, in the same quiet, incremental way that all the truest things grew, that this was simply the name of what had already been true. She felt the mark settle into her skin, like something finding its correct position after a long time spent slightly displaced. Her wolf, the old, pre-classificatory thing she carried, the sovereignty root she had always owned and never had language for, recognized it without drama, the way a door recognizes a key, with the smooth, irrevocable ease of two things that were built for each other. She said, against his collar, "I am not good at ceremonies." "I know," he said. "I chose the library specifically." 2 years after that, there was a morning in the library when the lamp was already lit and Rhea was already there, and what was new about that morning was the small object on the table beside her document. A carved wolf, pale wood, sized for a small hand, one ear slightly misaligned, in the way of things made by a patient craftsman who is still learning. Luca had sent it from the southern border. She had written him 4 letters over the 2 years. He had written back 6 times in a careful, uneven hand that was getting less uneven with practice, and the carved wolf was an answer to her mention, in the most recent letter, that she was expecting a pup in the early winter. He had carved it himself, he wrote. The ear had not come out right. He hoped it was still good. Caspian came in and picked it up and examined the misaligned ear with the focused, serious attention he brought to craftsmanship. He set it back down on the table. He looked at Rhea. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the spring morning was coming in gray and pale and entirely unhurried, and the kitchen garden below the library window was beginning, just barely, to smell of wet earth again.